Somewhere on a battlefield in 9th century England, in the moments before a Viking line broke into a charge, a small group of men stood apart from the rest. No armor, foaming at the mouth, eyes fixed on nothing. The textbooks will tell you they were berserkers, the rage warriors of Norse legend, said to feel no pain and no fear, and that what put them in that state was a mushroom. The red and white toadstool of folklore. For 2 centuries, that was the answer. A drug, a trance, a vanished cult of warriors lost to history. Then ancient DNA was extracted from their bones, and modern toxicology reopened the case. Almost every part of the textbook story fell apart. The drug was not what we were told. The men were not who we were told. And more unsettling than that, they never actually disappeared. Their genes are still walking modern Norway. To understand what the evidence overturned, you have to first understand what the evidence was overturning. And that means going back to the source material itself, the body of medieval literature in which the berserker first appears as a recognizable figure. The Old Norse sagas, composed in Iceland and Norway between the 12th and 14th centuries, but drawing on oral traditions that ran centuries deeper, describe these men in language that is remarkably consistent across separate texts, written by separate authors in separate generations. The Ynglinga saga, compiled by the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson in the early 13th century, describes warriors who went into battle without armor, who were as strong as bears or wild bulls, who killed men with single blows, and whom neither fire nor iron could harm. Egil's saga, one of the most detailed surviving accounts, describes the grandfather of its protagonist as a man who became a berserker by night and could not be approached by his own household. The Hrafnsmal, a 9th century skaldic poem composed in honor of King Harald Fairhair of Norway, lists berserkers among the king's elite warriors and describes them biting the rims of their shields before combat and howling like animals as they advanced. The word itself has been argued over for centuries. Berserker in Old Norse is a compound, and the second element is unambiguous. Serker means shirt or coat. The first element, beer, has 2 competing readings. It may mean bear, identifying the warrior as one who wore a bearskin garment, or it may mean bear, identifying the warrior as one who fought without a shirt at all. Both readings have defenders. The saga record supports both, describing some berserkers in animal pelts and others stripped to the waist in defiance of the cold. What the word does not describe is a casual category. The berserker was a specific type of warrior with a specific function, and the function was understood across the Viking world. Their place in Norse society was contradictory. They were, on one hand, elite warriors, deployed as the personal guards of kings and the shock troops of major raids. The Hrafnsmal places them at the inner circle of Harald Fairhair's household. Egil's saga describes them as men whose service was sought by rulers across Scandinavia. They were, on the other hand, feared and avoided. The same texts that praise their battlefield value describe them as dangerous to live near, prone to attacking neighbors during fits of rage, and frequently killed by their own communities once their usefulness in war had ended. Several saga episodes record berserkers being hunted down and executed in peacetime by ordinary farmers acting in self-defense. The chronology and geography of their deployment was also specific. The berserker phenomenon is concentrated in the period from roughly the 8th through the 11th centuries, with its densest documentation in Norway and Sweden, and its battlefield record stretching across the entire Viking diaspora, from the British Isles to Francia to the eastern river systems of what is now Russia. After the Christianization of Scandinavia in the 11th and 12th centuries, the figure essentially disappears from the record. Icelandic law codes from this period explicitly outlaw the practice. Whatever institution had produced the berserker was dismantled within a few generations, and the figure passed from active warrior into legend. This is where the central puzzle of the berserker has lived for the better part of 1,000 years. The saga descriptions are too consistent across separate texts and too physiologically specific to be pure literary invention. The shaking, the foaming, the apparent immunity to wounds, the the collapse and prolonged exhaustion that followed combat. These are not the embellishments of poets. They describe a physical state that something was inducing in a specific category of men, on demand, before battle. Something pharmacological was happening. The state had a name. The men who entered it returned as different people, or did not return at all. For 1,000 years, the question was what triggered it. The answer that settled into textbooks across the 19th and 20th centuries arrived from an unlikely source. In 1784, a Swedish theologian and natural historian named Samuel Odman published a short paper proposing that the berserker rage was the result of consuming Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric mushroom, the iconic red-capped, white-spotted toadstool that grows across the boreal forests of the northern hemisphere. Odman was not a pharmacologist. He had never tested the mushroom on a human subject. He had never examined a Viking-era skeletal remain or analyzed any chemical residue from a Norse archaeological site. What he had was a literary argument and a comparative one. His reasoning ran along two lines. The first was geographic and cultural. Odman pointed to documented use of Amanita muscaria among the indigenous peoples of Siberia, where shamans of the Koryak, Chukchi, and Sami traditions consume the mushroom for ritual trance and visionary states. He drew a line across the map from the Uralic peoples of Siberia to the Norse peoples of Scandinavia, argued that the cultural distance between them was smaller than it appeared, and proposed that knowledge of the mushroom's effects could have traveled west into the Viking world along the same trade and migration routes that connected the two regions. The second line was pharmacological in the loosest sense. Odman had read accounts of Siberian Amanita use describing dissociation, distorted perception, reduced sensitivity to pain and agitation. He matched these against the saga record of berserker behavior and concluded the fit was close enough to publish. The theory was elegant. It explained the rage. It explained the foaming. It explained the apparent immunity to wounds. It connected the Norse warrior tradition to a wider Eurasian shamanic context, which appealed to the comparative mythology of the period, and it was easy to remember. A red and white mushroom with a dramatic visual signature, a warrior cult, a transformation into rage. The picture had narrative force. For 2 centuries, this became the accepted answer. Odman's hypothesis appeared in encyclopedias, in popular histories, in academic surveys of Norse culture, in school textbooks, in television documentaries, and eventually in the imagery of fantasy literature and video games that drew on Viking material. Every modern depiction of a mushroom-eating rage warrior, every illustration of a berserker with a fly agaric in his hand, traces back to a single 18th century Swedish theologian who had reasoned by analogy from a culture 2,000 miles east of Norway and never tested his own claim. The theory survived because nothing better replaced it. Throughout the 19th century and most of the 20th, the tools to test pharmacological claims about historical populations did not exist. There was no chemical residue analysis of Viking-era ceramics. There was no systematic forensic toxicology of skeletal remains. There was no archaeobotany capable of identifying plant material in burial contexts at the level of detail that would later become routine. Researchers studying the berserker had access to the saga texts and to whatever scattered grave goods had been recovered in the early phases of Scandinavian archaeology, and they were doing the best they could with the tools available. In the absence of evidence, an elegant hypothesis from 1784 held its ground simply by being there first. It was, in the most literal sense, a guess that had hardened into fact through repetition. The accumulated weight of 2 centuries of citation gave the mushroom theory the appearance of established knowledge. By the late 20th century, it was difficult to find a popular account of the Vikings that did not mention Amanita muscaria as the chemical engine of the berserker phenomenon. The hypothesis had become so embedded in the cultural memory of the Viking Age that questioning it felt like questioning the Vikings themselves. The problem was that nearly every part of it had been built before anyone could read the actual chemistry. And when the chemistry finally arrived, the textbook version did not survive contact with it. Modern toxicology began to dismantle the mushroom theory in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and it did so by asking a question that Audubon had never asked. What does Amanita muscaria actually do to a human body? The answer, when researchers compiled the clinical literature on accidental and deliberate ingestion across 2 centuries of medical case reports, did not match the saga record at all. The active compounds in fly agaric are muscimol and ibotenic acid. Both are powerful neurotoxins that act on the central nervous system, and the cluster of effects they produce is well documented. The dominant symptoms are sedation, nausea, vomiting, profuse sweating, ataxia, which is the loss of muscle coordination, confusion, slurred speech, and in significant doses, unconsciousness. The mushroom is a depressant. It is not a stimulant. A man who had eaten Amanita muscaria in a quantity sufficient to alter his mental state would be more likely to vomit on himself and fall asleep than to charge a fortified shield wall in the front rank of a Viking army. The Siberian shamanic comparison, which had anchored Oudman's theory for 2 centuries, also broke down on closer inspection. When researchers actually examined the ethnographic record of Amanita use among the Koryak, the Chukchi, and the Sami, they found a tradition of visionary trance, of dream interpretation, of communication with spirits. They did not find a tradition of combat enhancement. The Siberian shamans who consumed the mushroom did so in stillness, often lying down in a yurt or a tent while attendants watched over their bodies for hours. They did not pick up axes and charge into battle afterward. The cultural function of the mushroom was the opposite of what the Berserker hypothesis required. The pharmacological problem became impossible to ignore. The saga record describes warriors who showed dramatically increased physical capacity, who fought through wounds that would have stopped an ordinary man, who maintained coordinated combat performance for the duration of an engagement, and who collapsed only after the battle had ended. Amanita muscaria does not produce that profile. It produces something closer to its inverse. By the early 2010s, researchers were actively looking elsewhere. The leading alternative that emerged from this work was Hyoscyamus niger, the plant known in English as black henbane. Henbane grows wild across North Europe, including throughout Scandinavia. It was known to Norse-era herbalists. Its active compounds, hyoscyamine and scopolamine, are tropine alkaloids, the same chemical family that produces the effects of belladonna and datura, and they act on the body in a way that is fundamentally different from the muscarinic toxins of the fly agaric. The clinical profile of henbane intoxication is documented in modern toxicology cases, and the match to the saga record is close to exact. Henbane produces severe agitation rather than sedation. It produces vivid hallucinations, often with violent or paranoid content. It produces dramatic dissociation from pain, which is one of its most consistent reported effects in poisoning cases. It produces tachycardia, dramatically elevated heart rate, and the flushed, hot skin that comes with it. It produces a distinctive symptom that appears repeatedly in the saga descriptions of berserker behavior, which is foaming or frothing at the mouth, caused by the suppression of the body's normal swallow reflex. And it produces, in the recovery phase, a profound and prolonged exhaustion that can last for days, matching exactly the post-battle collapse described in Eagle's saga and elsewhere in the literature. The fit was not approximate. It was item by item. Where Amanita produced sedation, henbane produced agitation. Where Amanita produced nausea and stillness, henbane produced violent activity and pain immunity. Where Amanita produced no documented combat tradition anywhere in the world, henbane produced exactly the symptom profile that Norse warriors had been described as displaying for 1,000 years. Henbane fit. Mushrooms did not. The question that followed was obvious. If the right plant had been identified, was there any physical evidence that the Vikings had actually used it? The evidence arrived from the ground. In 1977, Danish archaeologists excavating a Viking-era cemetery at Fierkat, a fortified ring-shaped stronghold built during the reign of King Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century, opened a burial that did not match the others around it. The grave belonged to a woman dated to roughly 980 AD, and the goods buried with her marked her as a person of unusual status. She had been laid to rest in a wagon body, a treatment reserved for the highest-ranking individuals. She wore silver toe rings, an ornament unknown elsewhere in the Scandinavian record. She had been buried with a bronze bowl from Central Asia, a metal wand of the kind associated in saga literature with ritual specialists, and a set of objects that the excavators were initially unable to interpret. Among them was a small leather pouch. Inside the pouch were several hundred seeds. When the seeds were sent for identification, they were Hyoscyamus niger, black henbane. The find established something that the saga record had only implied. Henbane was being deliberately collected, processed, stored in a sealed container, and buried with a person whose other grave goods marked her as a ritual practitioner. The Firkat woman has since been identified by most researchers as a vulva, a Norse seeress, a category of ritual specialist documented in the Eddic poetry as women who traveled between communities performing ceremonies, interpreting visions, and administering substances that altered the mental states of those who consumed them. The Firkat burial was not the only find. Subsequent excavations across Scandinavia have produced henbane seeds in contexts associated with warrior burials, ritual deposits, and high-status graves dating across the Viking Age. The plant was being grown, harvested, and curated within Norse society, and the contexts in which it appears in the archaeological record are consistently ritual rather than domestic. This was not a kitchen herb. It was a controlled substance, handled by specialists, deployed for specific purposes. The forensic case strengthened further when researchers compared the documented symptoms of henbane intoxication against the specific cluster of behaviors recorded in the saga literature. The match held across every category. The shaking that the sagas describe before combat is consistent with the early agitation phase of tropane alkaloid poisoning. The foaming at the mouth, mentioned repeatedly in descriptions of berserkers entering their state, is consistent with the suppression of the swallow reflex caused by scopolamine. The apparent immunity to wounds during battle is consistent with the dissociative analgesia that henbane produces in significant doses. The collapse after combat and the prolonged recovery period of multiple days during which the warrior was unable to function matches the documented exhaustion phase of tropane alkaloid recovery almost exactly. Eagle's saga describes a berserker named Liaut entering a state in which he howled and bit his shield and being incapacitated for days afterward. The clinical literature on henbane recovery describes exactly this profile. The ritual context implied by the Firkat find also fit the saga record in a way that the mushroom theory never had. The berserker in the saga literature is not a man who eats something on his own initiative the morning before a battle. He is part of an organized cohort, drawn from specific lineages, attached to specific kings, deployed in specific formations, and subjected to initiation rituals that the texts describe but rarely explain in detail. The administration of a controlled and dangerous plant by trained ritual specialists fits this picture. A man eating a mushroom he had foraged himself does not. The drug, in other words, was not a personal choice. It was a tool of a system. The henbane was administered, the dose was controlled, the recovery was managed, and the warrior who emerged from the experience was not acting alone. He was the output of an institution that had grown a plant, trained a specialist, prepared a ritual, and produced, on demand, a man capable of doing what ordinary men could not. The pharmacological question had been answered. The men themselves remained. For most of the modern era, the berserkers had been treated in popular and scholarly writing as a category apart from ordinary Norse society, and a recurring theme in 19th and early 20th century scholarship was the suggestion that they represented a distinct ethnic or tribal lineage, a separate population, perhaps descended from an older substrate of northern European inhabitants, perhaps imported from elsewhere in the Viking trade network, but in any case biologically distinguishable from the farmers and fishermen who made up the bulk of the Scandinavian population. The berserker in this reading was not just culturally different, he was genetically other. This was a theory built, like Oddman's mushroom hypothesis, in the absence of the evidence required to test it. And like the mushroom hypothesis, it did not survive the arrival of that evidence. The broader project of ancient DNA analysis on Viking Age skeletal remains accelerated dramatically through the 2010s, drawing on the same sequencing technology that had reshaped the study of prehistoric populations across Europe and the Americas. The work culminated in a landmark study published in 2020, in which an international team led by researchers at the University of Copenhagen sequenced the genomes of more than 400 individuals from Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia and the Viking diaspora, from Norway and Sweden to the British Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and the eastern river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. The study overturned several long-standing assumptions about Norse genetic identity. The Vikings were not, as had often been assumed, a uniform Scandinavian population. The genetic record showed significant gene flow into Scandinavia from southern Europe, the British Isles, and the Asian steppe across the Viking Age, producing a heterogeneous society in which individuals of widely differing ancestries lived, fought, and were buried alongside one another. Within this larger picture, researchers were able to examine specific high-status warrior burials with greater resolution than had ever been possible. The skeletal remains identified through grave goods, burial position, and skeletal trauma patterns as belonging to elite warriors, including a number of burials interpreted as berserkers or members of comparable warrior cohorts, did not show the genetic signature that the older theories had predicted. They were not outliers. They were not concentrated in any unusual ancestry cluster. They did not carry markers indicating descent from a separate population. They sat squarely within the mainstream genetic distributions of Viking Age Norway and Sweden, indistinguishable at the level of ancestry from the farmers, the fishermen, and the craftsmen buried in nearby graves. The implication was specific. The berserker was not a genetic outlier. He was not a foreign import or the descendant of a vanished tribe. He was a local man, drawn from the same population. That worked the fjords and farmed the inland valleys, and what set him apart from his neighbors was not his bloodline, but the institution that had claimed him. The capacity for the berserker gang was not in the genes. It was in the system that selected him, trained him, administered the henbane, and deployed him on command. This finding inverted the question that had occupied researchers for over a century. The interesting thing about the berserker was no longer who he was descended from. The interesting thing was what had been done to him. The transformation that the saga record described, the rage, the foaming, the immunity to pain, the post-battle collapse, was not the expression of an inherited trait. It was the output of a pharmacological and ritual pipeline that converted ordinary Norwegian men into a specific kind of weapon. The berserker, in this reading, was not a creature. He was a product. And the production line ran through specialists like the Fire-Cat woman, who grew the plant, prepared the dose, and administered it to men whose ancestors had farmed the same valleys for generations. When the institution ended, the production line ended with it. But the men themselves and their genetic material did not end. They went somewhere. The DNA could now show where. The answer is the part of the story that the title promised, and it is also the part that requires the most careful framing. Population-scale genetic studies of present-day Scandinavians, drawing on tens of thousands of sequenced genomes from Norwegian, Swedish, and Icelandic biobanks, have established direct and traceable continuity between the Viking Age population and the modern Scandinavian one. The genetic distance between a 10th century Norwegian warrior and a 21st century Norwegian farmer is in most cases statistically negligible. The same Y chromosome haplogroups documented in Viking-era warrior burials, including burials interpreted as belonging to berserker cohorts, are present at high frequencies in modern Norwegian men today. Specific lineages traced through ancient DNA have been matched to living descendants in the same geographic regions where the original burials were excavated. The berserkers, as genetic individuals, did not disappear with the Christianization of Scandinavia in the 11th century. The institution that produced them disappeared. The ritual specialists who controlled the henbane disappeared. The pharmacological pipeline that converted ordinary men into the warrior state was dismantled within a few generations of the conversion, and Icelandic law codes from the period explicitly outlawed the practice of going berserk. But the men themselves did not vanish. They fathered children before the institution ended, and during the centuries in which it operated. Those children fathered children. The chain has not been broken in the 1,000 years that have passed since the last documented berserker laid down his axe. The contrast with the cultural memory of the berserker is striking. In popular history, in fantasy literature, in film and television, the berserker is treated as a vanished archetype, a creature of saga and legend, extinct with the end of the Viking Age. The figure has the same narrative shape as the Anasazi of the American Southwest or the Bronze Age cultures of the Mediterranean, a people whose disappearance is the central fact of the story. The DNA tells a different story. The disappearance never happened. What ended was not a population, it was a practice. This distinction matters, and it is worth stating carefully. The persistence of berserker ancestry in modern Norway is not a claim that modern Norwegians carry some hereditary capacity for rage, or that the descendants of berserkers are in any way biologically different from their neighbors. The berserker gang was a cultural pharmacological phenomenon. It required the plant, the specialist, the ritual context, and the social institution that organized all three. None of those things are encoded in DNA. What is encoded in DNA is ancestry, and ancestry is a record of who fathered whom, not of what they did for a living. The berserker bloodline is not a monster's bloodline, it is simply a Norwegian one. What the genetic evidence does show is that the figure of the berserker, as a category of person, was never a separate thing from the broader Norwegian population in the first place. He was drawn from it, transformed by it, and reabsorbed into it when the institution that defined him was abolished. The men who returned from raids, who survived the institution, who lived past the typical lifespan of a warrior in that role, settled into the same villages and farmed the same valleys as everyone else. They married, they had children. The genetic signal of their lineages flowed back into the population pool from which they had been recruited. The men buried at Fjerkat and the other sites where the henbane and the warrior remains have been found are, in genetic terms, the direct ancestors of the population that lives in modern Norway today. There is no separate berserker descent line that survived alongside the mainstream. There is only the mainstream itself, which absorbed them. The DNA now confirms what the demography had always implied. The berserkers did not go anywhere. They simply stopped being berserkers and went home, and their descendants are still there, in the same valleys, on the same farms, looking exactly like everyone else. Return to the battlefield. The foaming warrior, the legend, the figure stripped of armor in the front rank of a Viking line. The mushroom story, repeated for 2 centuries on the strength of an 18th century guess, was wrong. The drug was henbane, grown and stored and administered by trained ritual specialists like the woman buried at Fjerkat with hundreds of seeds in a leather pouch. The berserkers themselves were not a separate people, not a foreign elite, not a vanished tribe. They were ordinary Norwegian men, transformed by an institution that no longer exists, whose descendants live in the same valleys their ancestors raided from. The real surprise of the berserker story is not the drug, it is the disappearance, and the fact that the disappearance never actually happened. The institution ended. The men did not. The only thing that ever vanished was the system that made them.